With the United States Supreme Court taking up the case of the Defense of Marriage Act and California's Proposition 8, the issue of homosexuality and same-sex marriages has moved to the foreground of the minds of many Americans. In the Catholic sphere, a Catholic high school, McQuaid Jesuit High School, which happens to be my alma mater, recently shook the Catholic world by announcing that it was going to allow a gay couple to attend prom together. And so this has created all kinds of hysteria in the media, and people are really beginning to become confused and wondering whether the church is in fact preaching a message of love or one of bigotry and hatred. I saw this displayed very potently on an internet post that says, "Jesus preached a message of love. Why does the church continue to preach a message of bigotry and hatred?" And I think that captures the sentiments of so many people in our society. And so I want to use this video to explain to people that the church does in fact preach a message of love, even though it's not popular or perceived that way in our popular society. And in order to do that, I'm going to table for a minute the reasons for the church's teaching on same-sex marriage. But let's just assume that the church truly does believe what she teaches about homosexuality and same-sex marriage, which is namely that homosexuality is in fact a disordered orientation, and that homosexual acts are intrinsically evil acts, which is a technical way of saying that they're sinful on all occasions. There's not a situation that justifies the acts. And that marriage between people of the same sex simply isn't possible. Now, if we truly believe this, if anybody truly believes this, and they see somebody doing something contrary to that, then we'd have to say the loving thing to do would be to call them back into union with God. Because as we know, sin jeopardizes somebody's eternal salvation. So a loving thing to do isn't to leave somebody alone in their sin and just let them be. If you truly care about somebody, you're going to want them to turn away from their sin and to enter into that proper relationship with God. And so that's where the message of love is in this Catholic teaching. Now, I'll be the first to admit that you'll probably find plenty of Catholics and plenty of people who are acting out of bigotry and hatred. So, that's just a reality. But that's not the church's motivation. And the church doesn't ask people to act out of that space. And to the extent that people are doing that, they too are sinful and need to be called into conversion as well. Now, some people throw out the argument, why does the church even get involved with this? She's got enough problems with the sex abuse scandal and other things. Why does she even get involved in this situation? First of all, the church does have plenty of problems with the sex abuse scandal. Nobody's denying that at all. And it's certainly something that the church is working to address. But that doesn't mean that the church can't also focus on other issues as well and take kind of a holistic approach. The same thing would be true as if you have one friend who's in a dire situation and another friend all of a sudden you find in a dire situation as well. It doesn't mean that you ignore that until you've helped your first friend. So the church can do multiple things at one time. Now, the church's teaching, the reason for getting involved in other people's lives, so to speak, goes right back to her scriptures. In the story of Cain and Abel, which is found in the book of Genesis, we hear the story where Cain murders his brother, and then God comes out looking for Abel and says to Cain, "Cain, where is Abel?" And Cain responds by saying, "Am I my brother's keeper?" The answer that God gives is, of course, yes, as a matter of fact, you are. And we see this over and over again in Scripture. We see it in the prophets, where God is constantly sending the prophets out to foreign nations and pagan lands to call them to conversion, to say, if you don't fix your way of life, if you don't get rid of this sinfulness in your life, some malady is going to fall upon you. And he tells the people through the prophet Ezekiel that if you don't call people to conversion, if you just let a sinner stay in his sinful state, then I'm going to hold that against you. And so it's important for us to call people to conversion, to that way of life. And the reason is because we want people to live in a properly ordered relationship so they can be drawn into the life of God. Because that's where they're going to find their ultimate happiness, their ultimate fulfillment. See, Catholics, we say that the glory of God is a human being fully alive. That's St. Irenaeus' famous quote, which means that God is given glory. He takes glory in us when we're fully alive, but we're only fully alive to the extent that we live in true freedom. Now, for Catholics, true freedom means that we have freedom from sin, freedom to live as the children of God. That's the freedom that Jesus came, suffered, died, and rose from the dead for us to have, is that freedom to live as the children of God so that sin would no longer master us and dominate our motives. And so the Catholic Church says that's what true freedom is. It's not the ability to do whatever I want, whenever I want, with whomever I want, for how long I want, and all that kind of thing. No, true freedom means that I can live in accord with God's divine plan for me. I can live in accord with the way that God created the universe, in harmony with the divine order, in harmony with God's moral precepts. You see, when God gives us his laws and precepts, he doesn't do so for his own jollies or for his own sake. He does so for our well-being because God himself wants us to have that eternal happiness with him. He wants us to be in relationship with him. And so the church proclaims this good news that God has given us these precepts in the same way that parents give children their moral precepts and their rules and their regulations. You know, parents don't give children laws and rules so that they can make them miserable. I mean, no parents are sitting around saying, how can we make our child miserable? I got it. You know, you tell him to take out the trash, and then I'll go tell him to make his bed, and then you tell him to do his homework, and then it'll be time for him to go to bed, and he'll be miserable. You know, that's not it at all. But rather, parents give us these rules and laws so that we can enter into relationship with them and become the best people that we can be. Well, that's the same thing God is looking for. He's calling us to relationship with him by being the best people we can be. And to the extent that we ignore his commands and his precepts, we push God away and we don't enter into union with him, but instead kind of isolate ourselves from God. And that's not going to lead to our happiness. We might take temporary pleasure in something. I mean, I'm sure there were times when I was younger that I took pleasure in mistreating my younger brother and sister. But tormenting my brother and sister is not the relationship that God has called me into with them. He's called me into a properly ordered relationship with them that involves having love at the core of that relationship. And so to the extent that I want to torment my brother and sister, I'm actually moving away from God and not into union with him. Well, the same is true with anything in which we're taking our own laws and pushing God away because we want what we want rather than what God has divinely ordered for us. See, ultimately we know that God has a better perspective than we have. God knows what's good for us, and so he gives us what is good. To the extent that we reject that, we're ultimately going to find ourselves in misery. To the extent that we embrace it, we're going to find ourselves in true happiness and union with God. And so that's what the Catholic Church is trying to proclaim when she's calling people away from their sinfulness and into a properly ordered relationship. She's not proclaiming a message of bigotry and hatred. She's proclaiming this message of love, saying, I'm sincerely concerned about you and your eternal salvation, and I want you to be happy. And what you're doing is not going to lead to happiness. It's only going to lead to misery. Come into this properly ordered relationship so that you can experience true happiness and true union with God.